If you knew me in college, you'd know that I had an enormous amount of respect for Sam Harris as an author, philosopher, and speaker. To this day, my favorite book of all time is Letter to a Christian Nation, which may seem like a peculiar pick to be someone's favorite book of all time, but that book is very meaningful to me because it set me on a trajectory that shaped my thinking in a lot of ways. It's also very well written, savage, and concise. It's the only book I've ever plowed through in one sitting. That book was my first introduction to Sam Harris, and of course, given how much I loved it, I went on to read all his other books and binge watch all of his talks and debates on YouTube. I was one of those fans that would passionately defend him against his critics, most of whom at the time were disingenuous. He was constantly smeared by leftists as being Islamophobic, racist, bigoted, etc. Considering I was familiar with pretty much everything he had written, I could see the flaws in his critics' arguments and how they were misinterpreting his views. It was pretty maddening to see people tear him apart for views he didn't hold. I still largely agree with his views on Islam and religion in general. If you aren't familiar with his views on Islam, I would encourage you to actually read his work or listen to him talk, rather than read or listen to what other people have to say about him. Go read the Quran. You can search Skeptic's annotated Quran and it shows you the full text, plus it's categorized so you can compare the good stuff with the bad stuff. It'll become very clear that Islam is not a religion of peace. Yes, there are plenty of peaceful Muslims, but the doctrine of Islam is brutally violent and misogynistic. But over the past few years, I've lost a lot of respect for Sam, and I know I'm not alone. It feels like a dagger to the heart. My biggest issue is that he does not live up to the values that he preaches. For someone who criticizes others for being unreasonable and tribalistic and promoting pseudoscience, Sam is the pot calling the kettle black. To give some context, I went vegan 7 years ago, right around the time that I discovered Sam Harris. As I was reading The Moral Landscape, I was thinking, wow, Sam is making a solid argument for animal rights. I thought for sure one day he would realize his hypocrisy and go vegan. If you're not vegan and you just stumbled across this video because you're a former fan or current fan of Sam Harris, please don't be a big baby and click away. The rest of this video is not about veganism, this is just one example to illustrate a broader point. Fast forward a few years maybe, and Sam actually starts taking this issue seriously and considers going vegan. He recognizes the ethical horrors of factory farming and commits to being pescatarian, voicing his concern that if he completely eliminates animal products from his diet, he'll develop deficiencies. Meanwhile, his vegan fans are ecstatic. Surely he'll do a modicum of research, guided by passionate encouragement from his vegan fans, and discover that the American Dietetic Association, the largest body of nutrition professionals in the world, have released a peer-reviewed statement that a well-planned vegan diet is suitable for humans at all stages of life, including athletes. Surely he would go vegan and start advocating for animal rights with his massive platform. Yeah, that is not what happened. Mr. Science and Reason fell victim to meat industry propagandists who convinced him that even his pescatarian diet was inadequate. He had a nutrition expert, Gary Taubes, on his podcast, which he titled, "What Should We Eat?", where he proceeded to spew a bunch of bullshit about how a low-carb diet is the way to go, and suggested that bacon and eggs is a healthier breakfast than oatmeal and a glass of orange juice. I was floored. He got a bunch of backlash from this episode because the information shared goes directly against the scientific consensus that cholesterol and saturated fat cause heart disease, our #1 killer. His fans insisted that he have someone else on, perhaps Dr. Michael Greger, Neil Barnard, or Caldwell Esselstyn. And to my recollection, he didn't even bother responding to the backlash. He left up the episode and moved on to other topics. I was disappointed to say the least, but I still looked up to him. Fast forward a few months or years, whatever, who's keeping track at this point, and Sam really starts to let me down. Keep in mind the timeline of Sam's downfall in my world lags a bit from the true timeline of events because I had stopped following his podcast super closely, and I gained knowledge later on that made previous quotes of his seem a bit more egregious. In 2016, he backed Hillary over Bernie in the primaries. At least he was fervently against Trump. Surely, after the news broke that the DNC rigged the election against Bernie and Hillary lost to Trump, he would come around and realize that perhaps he was wrong, that Hillary was more electable. Yeah, nope, that is not what happened. He dug his heels in deeper. As I started to learn more about politics, I became somewhat familiar with Noam Chomsky, and realized how whack Sam was for saying he'd rather elect Ben Carson than Noam Chomsky for president, because Ben Carson understands the threat of Islam. The direct quote was, "Given a choice between Noam Chomsky and Ben Carson, in terms of the totality of their understanding of what's happening now in the world, I'd vote for Ben Carson every time. Ben Carson is a dangerously deluded religious imbecile. The fact that he is a candidate for president is a scandal. But at the very least, he can be counted on to sort of get this one right. He understands that jihadists are the enemy." That is an outrageous statement, especially coming from a self-proclaimed champion of reason. Even if I agreed with Sam Harris and thought Noam Chomsky doesn't get it, in terms of the totality of their understanding of what's happening in the world, I would vote for Noam Chomsky every time. Kyle Klinsky made a fantastic video breaking down this quote and the misunderstandings between Sam and Noam. I'll also leave a link to Kyle's Ceasefire video, where he attempts to bridge the divide between the new atheists and their progressive critics, if you want more context. Noam Chomsky is famous for, among other things, co-writing the book Manufacturing Consent, exposing the corruption of the mainstream media and our government. He is a champion of the progressive movement and describes himself as a libertarian socialist. If one rejects religious conservatism and authoritarianism, as Sam does, then on numerous political issues, Noam Chomsky beats Ben Carson. This quote implies that Sam believes that Islam is the number one threat to our world. Of course he'd acknowledge that there are other threats, but this quote reveals that he believes Islamic terrorism is the most pressing issue of our time. Never mind climate change. I think Sam has a personal bias against Chomsky because of their failed attempt at a dialogue, which he published on his blog to illustrate the limits of discourse. You can judge the exchange for yourself. It was pretty frustrating and hard to follow because they were talking past each other. But if Sam were to look at things objectively without such a strong negative bias, perhaps he wouldn't vote for Ben Carson every time. What's frustrating is that Sam purports to look at things objectively. He values skepticism and rationality and mindfulness, and rejects dogma and pseudoscience. His whole MO is to base our beliefs on logic and reason and evidence, yet he fails to do so in several important areas. He has not retracted this statement. Another thing that I found incredibly troubling was his tacit support for Bloomberg prior to him dropping out, and his irrational contempt for Bernie Sanders. He can't seem to stop sharing trash articles on Twitter. In a recent podcast episode, he argued that it's better for a candidate to use their billions to fund their campaign and be beholden to no one than a candidate fund their campaign with millions of small dollar donations and have their opinions shaped by the mob. Understandably, many listeners interpreted this to mean that he favors oligarchy over democracy. In a follow-up episode, he tried to backpedal by saying that what he meant to convey was that his paramount concern is beating Trump, and he believes Bloomberg would have a better chance than Bernie Sanders. But how else could one interpret what he said, though? And why does he think Bloomberg has a better chance of beating Trump? He doesn't provide an actual argument. It's all unsubstantiated speculation. It is maddening that Democrats, including Sam Harris, shriek about electability all day long, but dismiss the polls that show Sanders has the best chance against Trump. And they value this strange notion of electability over policy. But electability is guesswork. Policy and voting records are far more concrete. No one can predict the future, and it's conceivable that Bernie could lose to Trump. But progressives like Kyle Klinsky make a better case for the electability of Bernie than Sam does for Bloomberg or any other centrist candidate. For example, one reason Trump won the election was because there was a significant number of 2 times Obama voters in the Rust Belt who were hurting financially because of NAFTA and other neoliberal policies, and Trump appealed to them with his anti-establishment rhetoric. They didn't like the guy, but he portrayed himself as an outsider, and Hillary did not represent them. These were key states to win with the Electoral College. Bernie Sanders appeals to these people. Bernie also has a very enthusiastic base, like Trump, but unlike any other establishment candidate. People underestimated Trump every step of the way in the last election. What makes you think that people aren't underestimating Bernie? We already tried running an establishment candidate against Trump and we lost. What makes you think that a weaker establishment candidate is the most electable against a stronger Trump? Joe Biden is Hillary 2.0 without the appeal of being the first female president, and with clear signs of cognitive decline. Mike Bloomberg, well, at this point, America has shown just how unappealing and unelectable he was. His support was bought, and it was fake. It's also very telling that Sam thinks that Bloomberg is beholden to no one. He's self-funding his campaign. He's not bought out by Wall Street or the pharmaceutical companies. He is a billionaire. He is most certainly interested in protecting the interests of himself and his billionaire friends. Sam then argues that Bernie Sanders and his supporters vilify billionaires, acting as if success always comes at the expense of others. He brings up J.K. Rowling as an example of a billionaire whose wealth did not come at the expense of others. But this is a straw man because when has Bernie Sanders ever gone after J.K. Rowling? He's always going after Bezos and the Walton family and the Koch brothers. If you look at the Forbes list of billionaires, almost all of them have amassed their wealth through exploitative and polluting industries. And with their wealth, they make the rules to enrich themselves even more, which comes at the expense of the poor and the working class. Although it's dubious to claim that anyone rightfully earns $1 billion, we're not really complaining about J.K. Rowling, who, by the way, demoted herself to multi-millionaire status because of her charitable giving. Good for her. What frustrates me the most is that Sam invites all these moderate Democrats and neocons on his podcast, and he whines and whines about the regressive left and SJWs, yet he doesn't have the gall to have on sensible leftists like Kyle Kulinski, Natalie Wynn, or Naomi Klein. I would love to see him have a discussion with Kyle about Bernie Sanders' policy proposals and his electability. Sam also plays into corporate media's fear-mongering about socialism. Again, he doesn't really provide a coherent argument against Bernie Sanders' Scandinavian-style system of social democracy. Bernie cannot be more clear that he opposes authoritarian dictatorships. He simply wants to restore democracy and implement socialist policies to combat the negative repercussions of free market capitalism. He has outlined how he is going to pay for his plans, which, yes, they're expensive, but what those concerned about the cost refuse to acknowledge is that it will cost us more in the long term if we fail to implement them now. Rather than explain why we should be scared of Bernie's socialist policies, Sam says, "The word socialism, whatever he may mean by it, I think it's fatal. It's literally like running as a pedophile, where you have to say, no, not the pedophile as you know it. The moment you have to explain this word, you're losing." Now, to be fair to Sam, he's not equating Bernie Sanders to a literal pedophile. But still, it's a pretty absurd thing to say. Even if it were true that Americans viewed socialism as on par with pedophilia, why not just explain why this is absurd? If Americans see no difference between a socialist and a pedophile, wouldn't it be paramount to change public perception? The last thing I want to bring up is that it seems that Sam has been so burned by the regressive left that he has run a little bit too far in the opposite direction. I wouldn't say he's alt-right, and I don't see him as necessarily guilty by association with the intellectual dark web. I certainly wouldn't place him in the same category as Jordan Peterson or Ben Shapiro. But he has become a bit of a reactionary and won't call a spade when it comes to clear examples of racism. This is evident in his housekeeping episode about white supremacy, where he argues that Trump's tweet telling the Squad to go back to their countries wasn't racist. This is one of the most clear examples of Trump's racism that you can find. Do I really need to explain this? It's also evident in his episode Among the Deplorables with Andrew Marantz. Sam and Andrew get into a heated debate on whether or not Tucker Carlson's quote referencing the Great Replacement Theory was a white supremacist dog whistle. Here's the quote. Virginia has transformed politically because it has been transformed demographically. 12% of Virginia is foreign-born, and that has made all the difference. They've replaced you. Sam kept trying to give Tucker the benefit of the doubt, saying, "You can read you differently there. He said 12% are foreign-born, so you is not just white people. You is anyone that is not foreign-born. Anyone who is born a U.S. citizen." Like, come on, dude. Most racists are not overt in their racism. He's really splitting hairs and bending over backwards here. This episode is definitely worth listening to. I'd never heard of Andrew Marantz before, but he was an amazing communicator. And I have to give Sam some credit for having on a sensible progressive. Perhaps it was damage control for his friendly chat with the notorious racist Charles Murray. The 1,000 caveats he gave at the beginning of his discussion with Murray did not absolve him of the fact that he painted Murray as a victim of PC hysteria and gave credence to the scientific data presented in the bell curve, which is widely contested. When I first listened to this discussion on race and IQ, I had no context whatsoever, so I didn't find anything Harris said to be damning. But upon further investigation, I found that the backlash he received was warranted. I'll link a comprehensive video on Charles Murray and the bell curve below if you're interested in exploring this subject. Sam seems very concerned about the overuse of words like racist, sexist, and bigot. I sympathize with his concern to a certain degree because there are plenty of examples of people being unfairly labeled as racist, sexist, or bigoted. But to act like this is a bigger problem than bigotry itself is misguided. It's like being more concerned about false rape accusations than rape. Both are a problem, but we have to look at the big picture. And as Ina pointed out in her episode responding to Sam's thoughts on white supremacy, it's easy to downplay an issue that does not affect you. Our perception of a problem is often informed by our personal experience. Sam sees white supremacy as a fringe philosophy that doesn't pose much of a threat to our society. As a white person, it may seem that racism isn't a huge problem anymore because we don't see it, we don't experience it. Racism, as well as other forms of bigotry, is on a gradient. But it's important to recognize that subtle racism is still racism. Saying something racist doesn't necessarily mean that you are a racist. I think the best way to distinguish between a racist and a non-racist is to look at, number one, how often do they say racist things? And number two, how do they respond when people call them out for saying something racist? Are they defensive and dismissive, or do they pause and reflect? Here I want to make an important caveat. If someone accuses you of racism, and after pausing and reflecting you still disagree with their accusation, you have every right to defend yourself. Reasonable people will accept your rational defense and not brand you as a racist. There is some level of subjectivity as to what is considered racist, even on the left. But having said all that, telling 4 non-white congresswomen to go back to their countries is pretty much universally accepted among liberals and progressives to be racist. I'm curious as to why Sam categorizes Trump as a racist, but not Mike Bloomberg or Charles Murray. None of these men are Klansmen, and all of them would denounce racism. Sam's standards are just unclear. I am not the arbiter of who is racist and who is not, so while I personally wouldn't brand Sam as a racist, at this point I can see why others might. I would place Sam a little left of center on the spectrum of anti-racist to full-blown racist. But of course, the center is not a great place to be, and defending racists like Charles Murray and Mike Bloomberg and splitting hairs over Trump's tweet and Tucker Carlson's obvious dog whistle is not a good look. In conclusion, have I lost all respect for Sam Harris? No. I still have a deep appreciation for the insight he has given me, and I'll always recommend Letter to a Christian Nation. But am I his #1 fan like I was in college? Far from it. I think the biggest takeaway is that no one is perfectly rational, myself included. No one is above cognitive biases that cloud our judgment. We should be skeptical of everyone, especially the people who preach about the importance of skepticism and critical thinking. It's funny that Sam's podcast was previously called Waking Up, and now it's called Making Sense. Did he change the name because he criticizes wokeness and didn't want to be associated with woke culture? Well, maybe he should change the name again because he hasn't been making a whole lot of sense lately. I'm particularly wary of channels with names like No Bullshit or The Truth or whatever because they're usually full of shit. With the exception of Knowing Better, that dude seems pretty humble. Anyways, thank you so much for watching, and be sure to subscribe for more videos.
Yo, how when me eat them, I wonder when me eat. When me tell them say me no eat no fish, nah, no meat now. How when me eat them, I wonder when me yam. When me tell them say that I'm a vegan, man. How when me eat them, I wonder when me eat. When me tell them say me no eat no fish, nah, no meat now.